May 8, 1945. The war in Europe is over. Germany has surrendered. But here's something they don't teach you in history class. In the weeks surrounding that date, something unprecedented happened. Not thousands, not hundreds of thousands. Nearly 2 million German soldiers walked out of the fight and into Allied hands. Some raised white flags. Others simply dropped their weapons and waited. Many marched for days just to surrender to the right side. And what happened next? It wasn't liberation. It wasn't simple imprisonment. For many, it was a nightmare that would last for years. Some would never return home at all. This is the untold story of what really happened to 2 million men who thought the worst was over when they surrendered. They were wrong. To understand the sheer scale of what happened, you need to picture the chaos of Germany in early 1945. The Wehrmacht, once the most powerful military machine in Europe, was collapsing from both sides. From the west, American, British, and French forces were pushing deep into the fatherland. From the east, the Soviet Red Army was steamrolling everything in its path, fueled by rage and revenge for what Germany had done to their homeland. German soldiers faced an impossible choice: keep fighting a war that was clearly lost, or surrender. But surrender to whom? This question would determine whether they lived or died. Here's what many people don't realize. By April 1945, the German military wasn't retreating in an organized fashion. It was disintegrating. Entire units simply stopped existing. Soldiers threw away their uniforms, burned their documents, and tried to blend in with civilians. Officers abandoned their men. Communication broke down completely. But for those who couldn't run or hide, surrender was the only option. And in those final weeks, the numbers were staggering. Between April and May 1945, the Western Allies captured approximately 1.5 million German soldiers. The Soviets captured even more on the Eastern Front. We're talking about numbers so large that the Allies literally didn't know what to do with them. Think about that for a second. How do you feed, shelter, and guard a population the size of a major city? Where do you put them? What do you do with them? The answers to these questions would shock the world. Here's a detail that tells you everything about the final days of the war. German soldiers weren't just surrendering, they were racing westward, desperate to be captured by Americans or British rather than Soviets. Why? Because word had spread through the German ranks about what was happening in the East. Soviet troops, after years of brutal German occupation that killed tens of millions of their people, were not in a forgiving mood. Stories of executions, brutal treatment, and deportation to Siberian labor camps spread like wildfire. So you had this bizarre situation, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers literally running away from one enemy to surrender to another. Units that had been fighting Americans in the morning would break contact, march east, fight through Soviet lines, and then surrender to Americans in the evening. Some soldiers walked for weeks. They crossed rivers, avoided Soviet patrols, traveled only at night. Entire divisions tried to break through Soviet encirclements just to reach American lines. One German general, Walter Wenck, famously held open an escape corridor near the Elbe River, allowing both soldiers and civilians to flee westward. His army wasn't fighting to win anymore. They were fighting to help people escape to the western side. The scenes at the American lines were surreal. GIs would wake up to find thousands of Germans waiting patiently to surrender. They came with their weapons, their vehicles, sometimes even their horses. They came alone in small groups and in formations of thousands. One American officer described it as the strangest thing I ever saw. They were our enemies yesterday. Today they were lining up like people waiting for a bus. But the Americans were overwhelmed. They had prepared for resistance, not for surrender on this scale. And this is where the story takes a dark turn. The Western Allies, particularly the Americans, suddenly had a massive problem. They had captured so many German prisoners that they couldn't possibly house them in traditional POW camps. There wasn't enough infrastructure, not enough guards, not enough food, not enough anything. So they improvised, and the result was the Rhine Wiesenlager, the Rhine Meadow Camps. Picture this: open fields along the Rhine River. No buildings, no barracks, no shelter of any kind. Just barbed wire fences enclosing huge areas of muddy ground. And inside those fences, hundreds of thousands of German prisoners. There were eventually over a dozen of these camps. Names like Remagen, Sinzig, Bad Kreuznach, and Rheinberg. Together, they held somewhere between 1 and 2 million German prisoners at their peak. The conditions were brutal. Prisoners had no shelter from rain, wind, or cold. They slept in holes they dug in the ground with their bare hands. Food was scarce. Clean water was almost non-existent. Sanitation was primitive at best. Here's something controversial that historians still debate today. The Americans classified these prisoners not as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention, but as disarmed enemy forces. This technical distinction meant they weren't entitled to the same protections, the same food rations, the same treatment that POWs were supposed to receive. Was this deliberate? Was it simply bureaucratic necessity? Historians disagree, but the result was the same. Hundreds of thousands of men living in conditions that would have been considered inhumane for animals. Survivors described the camps as hell on earth. Men died of dysentery, starvation, and exposure. The exact death toll is still disputed. Estimates range from around 3,000 to much higher numbers, depending on who you ask. Some German researchers have claimed hundreds of thousands died, though most mainstream historians consider these numbers exaggerated. What's not disputed is that the conditions were terrible, and that many men suffered greatly before the camps were eventually closed in late 1945. But if you think the Western camps were bad, the story of German soldiers who surrendered to the Soviets is far worse. Remember those soldiers who were desperate to surrender to Americans? They had good reason. The Soviets captured approximately 3 million German soldiers during the war, with a huge wave in the final months. These men were sent to a network of labor camps across the Soviet Union. Camps in Siberia, Kazakhstan, and other remote regions. Camps where temperatures dropped to minus 40 degrees. Camps where prisoners were worked to death in mines, forests, and construction projects. The Soviet Union had lost over 25 million people to the German invasion. Entire cities had been destroyed. The Nazi regime had deliberately starved, shot, and worked to death millions of Soviet POWs and civilians. Now the situation was reversed, and the Soviets showed little mercy. The numbers are horrifying. Of the roughly 3 million German soldiers captured by the Soviets, historians estimate that at least 1 million died in captivity. Some estimates go even higher. That's a death rate of over 30%. These men died from starvation, disease, exposure, exhaustion, and brutality. They died in frozen forests cutting timber. They died in mines digging coal. They died building the very infrastructure of the Soviet state. The last German POWs weren't released until 1956. That's 11 years after the war ended. Some men spent more than a decade in Soviet camps, not knowing if they would ever see home again. When these survivors finally returned to Germany, many were broken men. Physically wasted, psychologically scarred. Some weighed less than 100 pounds. They had aged decades in just a few years. Many could never speak about what they experienced. There's another chapter of this story that often gets overlooked. What happened to German prisoners handed over to France? France had been occupied by Germany for 4 years. The humiliation ran deep. When the war ended, the French government requested German prisoners for labor to help rebuild their devastated country. The Americans agreed, transferring hundreds of thousands of German POWs to French control. For many of these men, this was not an improvement. French camps were often poorly organized. Food was scarce because France itself was struggling to feed its own population. But there was something else. Revenge. Many French guards, some of whom had suffered under German occupation or lost family members, were not gentle with their prisoners. Reports of beatings, malnutrition, and harsh treatment were common. The International Red Cross raised concerns. Even American officials complained about the conditions. German prisoners in France were used for dangerous work, clearing minefields, for example. Thousands of German POWs were forced to walk through fields that their own army had mined, probing for explosives. It was a death sentence for many. The exact number who died in French captivity is hard to pin down, but estimates suggest at least 20,000, possibly many more. The last German prisoners weren't released from France until 1948, 3 years after the war ended. Eventually, most of the surviving German POWs did come home. But what did they come home to? Germany in 1945 was destroyed. Cities were rubble. Factories were ruins. The economy had collapsed. The country itself had been divided into 4 occupation zones and would soon be split into 2 separate nations. Many soldiers came home to find their houses destroyed, their families scattered or dead, their old lives completely erased. Some returned to find their wives had remarried, assuming they were dead. Others found that their hometowns were now in Soviet-controlled East Germany, a place they couldn't enter or didn't want to. The psychological trauma was immense. These men had fought for years, witnessed and participated in terrible things, spent months or years in brutal captivity, and now they returned to a society that didn't want to talk about any of it. Germany after 1945 wanted to forget. The collective strategy was silence. Don't talk about the war. Don't talk about what you did. Don't talk about what was done to you. Just rebuild. Just survive. This meant millions of men carried their trauma in silence. Alcoholism, depression, domestic violence, and suicide rates among returning POWs were extremely high, though rarely discussed. And here's the cruel irony. Many of these men were conscripts. They hadn't chosen to fight for Hitler. They had been drafted, handed a rifle, and told to march. Now they bore the weight of a regime's crimes, even if they personally had committed none. So what's the final count? What really happened to those 2 million German soldiers who surrendered? Here are the rough numbers. In Western Allied captivity, most German prisoners were released within a year or 2. The vast majority survived, though an unknown number died in the Rhine Lager and other camps. Estimates range from 10,000 to much higher, depending on the source. In Soviet captivity, the death toll was catastrophic. Somewhere between 1 and 1.3 million German POWs died. The survivors were held for years, some for over a decade. In French captivity, tens of thousands died from harsh conditions and dangerous labor. Add it all up, and over 1 million German soldiers who surrendered never made it home. They're buried in mass graves across Russia, in unmarked plots along the Rhine, in minefields across France. So what happened to the 2 million German soldiers who surrendered in 1945? They discovered that surrender was not the end of their suffering. It was the beginning of a new chapter. For some, that chapter lasted months. For others, years. For over 1 million, it was the final chapter of their lives. The story of German POWs after World War II is complicated. These men served a genocidal regime that caused unimaginable suffering across Europe. Many of their captors had lost everything to the German war machine. The desire for revenge, or at least indifference to German suffering, was understandable. But the scale of death in the camps, particularly in the Soviet Union, raises difficult questions about justice, revenge, and the treatment of defeated enemies. The next time you see footage of German soldiers surrendering in 1945, hands raised, looking relieved that the fighting was finally over, remember this. For many of them, the war didn't end that day. It was just beginning.